And I'd like to welcome you to the Arch Apprentice webinar on how to turn the Apprenticeship Levy into an opportunity for your business. Joining me this afternoon is Ben Rowland, who is the co-founder and commercial director for Arch Apprentices.
As Tim mentioned, I'm involved with Arch since the beginning, and it started actually as the training program, the apprenticeship training program for an employer, for a group of businesses called Glen and Chalcott. And so we've been on a 5-year journey to move from figuring out how on earth all this apprenticeship stuff works to having a program which I think we're now pretty proud of. It started nearly 1,500 people on their careers in digital and IT, many of them in the group, but many others with other employers as well. And we are conscious, I guess, that lots of you are being asked to kind of go through that 5-year journey in a 5-month period. You're really being forced through this by the Apprenticeship Levy, and what we are keen to do is hopefully give you some information today which will help you to do that. But bearing in mind we're kind of nearly there now. I know it seems like it's been a bit of a rush getting this levy kind of out there and helping people like you understand what it is from the government's point of view. But I guess we've been involved with it for such a long time now that we're really ready to go. And with only 61 days to go, 2 months really till May the 1st, we are excited by that. So what we're going to run through today, I just want to share with you my objectives for the session, and what I really love is for you to send in your objectives, your questions, if there's stuff you want us to cover, we'll see if we can. I then want to share just in a nutshell what the levy is all about. I think one of the key challenges people talk to us about is, there's guidance documents which are dozens of pages long, there's websites here, websites there. How can they explain it to colleagues in a really crisp and simple way? And I'd like to have a go at doing that for you in a nutshell. Then I want to go on to, I think, something that also gets lost in the conversation around the rules and what we can spend it on and how the calculation is done and so on and so forth. But it's actually, why should we be excited about apprenticeship training? What's different or special about apprenticeship training at all? And I think it's worth bearing that in mind. If you're trying to bring your organisation along with you, then actually having a really positive and exciting story to say is going to be, I think, important. And then I want to get to the bit which I think is probably what you've signed up for, but is the drier bit of this. But hopefully it will be more interesting and exciting in the context that I've put it in. But is what is the levy? As I said, there's, I think, the employer guidance runs 35 pages. I've tried to get it into 12 bullets or around that time. So there may well.
We need to find a way to do it like an interpretive dance or something like that.
Something like that, yeah, an easy way to do it. But I've had a go, and let me know how well you think I've done on that. And of course, if there are things I don't cover, then please do ask the questions as Tim directed. And then talking a little bit about the standards, which you'll hear lots of. What are these standards? What's different about them, and so on. And then also about, I think, eligibility, which is for us a really key change the government has brought about, which really makes the apprenticeship programme something that we think you have a right to be excited about. But let's see in 54 minutes' time whether you agree with that. So Tim, if we can move on to my objectives for the levy, which I think I've alluded to, but I've really, what I'm hoping you'll come out with is some more information and some more confidence about the technical aspects of the levy, feel more comfortable and confident talking to colleagues about it, understand it a little bit better yourself. But as I said, I'd love it if people left the webinar with a bit of a spring in their step. That may be a bit much to ask for, but definitely kind of excited about the positive aspects of the apprenticeship levy and what it might enable you to do. And we're not entirely altruistic here. We're also hoping that you remember us a little bit as well when you're doing your planning. But I guess my question is, what are your objectives? And please do kind of submit your questions at any time, starting now. Before I move on into the next slide, I guess I need to sort of, a bit of a disclaimer. One is, we don't know the answers to everything. I think the only thing that gives me comfort on that is I'm not sure anyone knows every answer to every aspect of this, but certainly send us questions. If we don't know the answer, we will be honest about that and get back to you as much as we can. And secondly, the legal disclaimer, which is, this is our interpretation, this is our view of the world. You should take advice from the SFA, from your tax representative, so on and so forth, because this is for information only. It's our view, doesn't constitute advice. So I hope that's okay. So in a nutshell, what is this apprenticeship levy? I think the 4 bullet points for us. First of all, an apprenticeship is a fantastic way to turbocharge someone's career. The nature of a good apprenticeship program, that blend of off-the-job training, with real technical instruction, meshed and merged and blended with on-the-job work, is what makes it so exciting. Certainly we've seen this. I mentioned those 1,500 people who started. When it works well, it works amazingly at turbocharging someone's career. And that's not just someone who's fresh out of school, the traditional apprentice, but actually people who've been in the job for a while or been in their career for a while can really get a boost from it. Secondly, the government is introducing the levy really to get companies to do what they should be doing anyway. And I think those companies who are already spending a lot on their training probably feel a bit resentful about this, but we know from the stats that there are lots and lots of companies who aren't spending as much as they should on training, and this is the government's way of forcing that to happen. Next up, we know each other well enough. Next up, what is it? Well, it's 0.5% of all payroll above 3 million, but collected on a monthly basis by HMRC, with all the stringent requirements and lack of optionality that entails, and available for you and your company to spend on government-approved apprenticeship training. What is that government-approved apprenticeship training? The last bullet point. Well, it's an approved apprenticeship standard or framework, and the standard specifies the skills, knowledge and behaviours that you would want a person to be able to routinely demonstrate in their job for them to qualify as an apprentice in that occupation. So that's it in a nutshell. But I suspect you want a little bit more detail to answer this question: how does an employee get most value from the levy? So, if I can, a couple of this is the bit which I think gets lost. I don't think the government's articulated this. I don't think we or the training provider community articulates it very well. We've all been historically so focused on funding rates and eligibility and all the dry rules that we forget to actually say to people what it is about apprenticeship that makes it really special. Recently, I was looking at a couple of training programs that have been put together by businesses completely outside of the levy. So one was in fact our own Glenning Chalcott group, who put together a high potential program for more senior executives about 5 years ago, and also Lenovo's European high performance development program. And actually, when you look at the program, those programs designed outside of any government constraints, they involve a cohort going through a program roughly a year long, in some cases a little more, in some cases a little less, going for some sort of big moment in time off the job training, with some mentoring along the way, requirements to show how they were applying their learning in the job, with the requirements to bring real problems and challenges from their work back into the training. And you look at those things and say, that's a well-designed apprenticeship program. So we think it's really important to think of an apprenticeship, if I can go on to the next slide, Tim, as a really, for the person who's going through it, a really special program, a memorable year or 18 months for them as they turbocharge their career. And it's to do with this blend of working and learning that doesn't typically happen if you're just doing off-the-job kind of training and qualifications. There's lots of research now, and I'm sure we're all familiar with our own examples where someone goes off the job training, thinks it's fantastic, but 2 weeks later, certainly 2 months later, can't really remember the relevance of that training. Well, an apprenticeship, when designed properly, means that learning really is embedded in what the person does. And we think of this, if we just ping one more slide.
Sorry, just going to pick you up there. I mean, I think one of the great things about the apprenticeship is that it's so relevant to that particular organisation as well, isn't it? But I just wanted to pick you up on one of the words you've got here, which is the word stigma. I think when we started, the whole concept of apprenticeship and being an apprentice was still seen by a lot of people, both educators and businesses, as being something which wasn't all, it didn't have the cachet, didn't have the prestige. Yeah. Do you think that is changing? Do you think this is the final sort of move which is going to make it much more acceptable?
So I think it's a really good question. I think it's changing in some key regards. I think when you speak to 18, 19-year-olds now and compare their views of how they view an apprenticeship compared to 18, 19-year-olds of, say, 5 years ago, I think it's changed dramatically because they are looking down the barrel of, people are talking about this 100K gap. In your first 3 years as an apprentice, you are likely to earn about 50K. If you've gone to university, you're likely to incur debts of 50K. So that's what they're looking at, and certainly with more and more
really attractive businesses, Google, Facebook, etc., using apprenticeships as ways to hire talent. It's really changing it for their minds. But I think the key thing here for people is if their views are, if they're existing employees and their impression of apprenticeships is 10 years out of date, it's important that they understand that this is an exciting CPD program for them. So I think there is still some stigma, and I think it's misplaced. So if you go on to the next thing, sometimes people talk about, working at an apprenticeship is working and learning. Our way of thinking about it is it's working multiplied by learning. It's a really exciting, when we see people go through the programs and you can see the interaction, the blend between this learning and working, it's really powerful.
And just to pick up on the point you mentioned about seeing some of those young people come through now, I mean, we're 5 years into Arch, and some of those young people from the first cohort now, they're in quite senior digital roles now at big organisations, aren't they?
Well, what's lovely is some of those cases where someone who came on as an apprentice and then themselves became the line manager of an apprentice, and now that new apprentice themselves have become the line manager of the next. So, as it were, 3 generations of apprentices, and on that career ladder, and being given pay rises, not for any kind of CSR, but because they're worth that and probably actually much more in the market. So yeah, it's exciting.
They're the best ambassadors themselves.
Always much better than me. Anyway, so I think there's also something about, when you're talking to your, if you're in HR or L&D and you're the one who's having to put this program together and you're concerned about how do I bring people on board, we think it's really important to understand how apprenticeships can really benefit the business as well as being the supply of talent. And I just want to use the example, we were with a market research company earlier this month, and they were saying they had in one department 4 PhD data scientists, and they said they don't need apprentices, they need another PhD data scientist. And what we asked them was, well, how do your PhD data scientists actually spend their time? And of course, what you can see on the slide is, it's the typical breakdown of how senior technical people spend their time. Of course, they spend as much time as they can using their technical nous, but they've also got to do the admin and management. And then there are also the unloved tasks at the side of the desk that typically don't get done or don't get done very well, simply because they're not that exciting, or they're below the person's pay grade, or they wish there was someone else to do them, but there isn't. And so we said, well, actually, and if you can press just to bring up this animation, if what you can do, an apprenticeship really flies, an apprenticeship program can really fly for a business, if you can find that magic sweet spot of converting unloved grunt tasks that are otherwise taking up the expensive time of senior people and convert them into the much loved tasks that a young person who's trying to find their way and prove their way can really grasp and do brilliantly. And in that way, of course, you are freeing up the senior time and in effect getting extra PhD data scientist time in this example, but only for the cost of the apprenticeship. And of course, next one on, Tim, thanks. What you are then doing is you're creating the talent pipeline for the future, because those people, whether it's after 3 months or 6 months or 18 months, begin to start moving off those training ground tasks and into delivering real, the value as well of the more senior stuff. And that's when it gets really exciting for the company. Finally, just want to say, before we go into some of the details of the changes, so I've talked about why we think participants in the program should be excited about it, because it's this amazing blend of learning and working, why companies can be excited about it, because it's a fantastic way to build a talent pipeline and get stuff done in the meantime. But why is government so excited about it? Well, government has, I think when you peel it back, and this sometimes we get the question is government sincere about this apprenticeship levy? We think they are, and they're using the levy as a way to address this conundrum that British government has always had, which is that British businesses are often and justifiably complaining about the lack of skills available to hire for their business. But at the same time, when you compare how much British businesses invest in training compared to our OECD peers, it's pretty embarrassing, actually. So what's the solution to this, or what's causing the problem? It seems to be this fear that you'll train people up on your budget, and then your competitors, having saved money, will then use that money to poach those staff who you've trained. So that seems to be what people think has been the reason for this gap between what businesses want and what's actually happening. And the levy is a way of doing that, because what it's doing is forcing every business to pay for training, but it's just up to them whether it's their training or someone else's training. We believe the government that they are sincere in making this happen. It's not just a kind of a tax ruse. Okay, shall we move on to the apprenticeship changes themselves? Are there any questions coming in, Tim, that we might want to?
Okay, Kirsty has said, nearly all our employees have degrees. How do you sell an apprenticeship to someone who already has a degree qualification?
Really good question. So the first thing is there is a rule that says that the apprenticeship has to be in a subject which is where the skills required are substantially different. So if someone's come straight out of a degree in, say, accounting, you are not allowed to put them onto an accounting apprenticeship that's lower than degree level. So that's the kind of the rule. But I think the question is not so much about the rules, but about how do you make it exciting to people. And I think there's a couple of things. One is you don't have to say it's an apprenticeship program. You can just say it's our graduate program, or if it's a graduate who's been in the business for a few years, it's a continuing professional development program, and it looks like this, and you'll get this out of it, and so on and so forth. And by the way, it's funded by the Apprenticeship Levy, and the qualification you get as an apprenticeship. So you don't have to, as it were, sell it as an apprenticeship. Two other things to do that people we've spoken about are doing. One we did a few years ago, we did a pilot apprenticeship program for government with Barclays Bank, and there was a mixture of people who had degrees and people who didn't have degrees on that program. And we were worried about the same thing. You know, would people, particularly those who had degrees, say, well, I'm going on an apprenticeship, I don't need to go on an apprenticeship program. But they had really strong, clear, a really strong, clear push from the top. So the champion of transformation in the bank got them in a room and said, I am really excited that you're on this program and doing this. And that leadership and championing from someone so senior made a really big difference. We're also talking to another financial services business who have come up with a really good way of making this exciting and desirable, which is to limit it. Which is to say, they're going out to people and saying, you know, we have 10 places on this course, it's worth X many thousands of pounds, limited slots. You apply, you tell us why you're, you know, why you're worthy of having this investment spent on you, and get your line manager to sign it off and relate it to your appraisal and so on and so forth. So making it a desirable, you know, a thing that's in limited supply and therefore desirable, as opposed to being something where, you know, certainly some firms we've talked to have said, oh, we've got to go out and somehow persuade people with degrees to take an apprenticeship program. And we think that's the wrong way around. We think flip it and make sure people really understand what an exciting program it is and make them want it.
I think a question that's coming from Tracy here is very relevant to this area as well. She said, I'm not so sure the stigma isn't still present. It isn't helped by the government's latest campaign using all young people to advertise apprenticeships. Missing a trick to show how mature people can take advantage. We do need to remember this isn't just for young people. How do you think we can help get a message out? And it's, you know, building on what you just said there, it used to be all about the sort of 16 to 24-year-olds, but actually now it's got a much wider reach, hasn't it?
Yeah, no, it certainly does. But I think you're right that the publicity doesn't. You know, that program, that advertising campaign was sort of a bit of a vestige of a previous bygone era. I think they'd already bought the media and had the ad made. So I think it is a really good point, and I think it's only together we kind of confront and address that. All we can do is share our own experience of where people who've got degrees, who've been on the programs, and their experience and so on has been really positive. They're really excited about being on the program.
So what describes your current perception? We've been talking a lot about the perception of it at the moment, so we've put a few ideas there, a few statements up there. If you could let us know which of these you feel best represents your current perception. Share those results with you as well so you can see the way 81% of people, that your perception of it is that it is to support the UK businesses to upskill, which is great.
I think that's right as well. I think the challenge is that the low score on that bottom one, because actually I think where this is going to really fly for businesses is when they can very comfortably and confidently say this is our, you know, a crucial part of our overall learning and development, our overall CPD program. And I'm not saying that happens overnight. I think it takes a long time to get to that position. Let's go through what the levy is. So 0.5% of payroll above £3 million. That includes bonuses and commissions. We have had the question, does the payroll include employers' NICs? No, it doesn't. It's based on gross pay, so it's everything that the employee earns. It does include bonuses and commissions, which is really important. It's calculated, thanks Tim, and paid monthly. It kind of will, for people who are on the cusp, it will kind of, well, for everyone, it will ebb and flow as payroll ebbs and flows. And there's a mechanism that your payroll people will need to be familiar with about how they manage that. But once it's in, it shouldn't be too arduous for them to do. For those of you who have operations across the UK, there is a complexity, which is that the apprenticeship levy, it's levied on all your UK payroll, but the funds and the distribution, the ability for you to spend it as vouchers on training providers and all of that is only for English employers. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have their own devolved funding system. So the question is, well, if it's levied on a UK payroll, what gets kept in the English system of spending it versus going out to the other regions? And it's done on the employee's domestic postcode. It's something that you're required to keep, you're required to keep on behalf of HMRC, so you do probably need to make sure that that's up to date. But if, say, 10% of your workforce live in Scotland, then 10% of your leviable amount will go to the Scottish Government, and then it's up to them to spend the system. So you will need to, if you have operations in Scotland, you will need to engage with that funding system to get your training in Scotland done. However, the levy can be used for people who might live in Scotland but work in England. So as long as 50% of their time is spent in a workplace in England, then you can use levy vouchers to spend on their training. Once that has been decided, that English amount, for the first year at any rate, the government's going to top that up by 10%, which for some people is adding 10% to the headache of how they can spend the levy, but for other people, obviously, you know, it's government showing it is sincere about wishing to see the amount of training go up, not just a kind of a way of saving, of reducing the public purse. How do you spend this money when it's in the account? Well, you spend it in the form of vouchers, which can only be used for, the vouchers appear on the Apprenticeship service, which is a new digital service. We'll send you the link to it if you haven't seen it already. It's open for sign up right now. And on that service, where you can see your account on the one hand, you can also then select training providers and specify employees who are to go on which courses with which training providers and starting when. So it has to be a training provider who has been approved and is therefore kind of appears on your apprenticeship service account. The vouchers expire after 2 years. This will happen, they'll use the oldest vouchers first automatically, so you don't need to worry about that. But what you do need to worry about is a stack of unused vouchers building up that actually you might not be able to spend. And the analogy I always use on this is it's like the milk in your fridge, where you're always looking for the oldest milk first, and you want to kind of manage your buying of milk from the supermarket or your deliveries, if you get deliveries, such that you don't end up with a whole ton of milk that's suddenly about to go off, and that you either have to throw away or make into a rice pudding that you don't really want. And conversely, you need to make sure you don't use up your milk so quickly that when you want some milk for a cup of tea, you wake up to discover that there isn't any left.
And also does a cooking webinar, in case you're wondering.
I wish I did. But we could get into an analogy about recipe cooking up a printer. Anyway, suffice to say that actually we've done some modelling, and those unused vouchers do build up quite quickly if you don't have a plan quite early doors to get some activity underway. We know that year one is going to be a learning year, an experimentation year for most people, as they figure out how they can use their levy, and which programs work, which participants, which types of employees benefit from it most for that particular employee. But there is this risk that because people think, oh, it's 2 years away, we've got 2 years to spend them. Actually, you'll be building up this pot of money that can only be used on training, and you may get to a point in summer 2020 where suddenly tens of thousands of pounds are leaving the business because you haven't, as it were, started a programme early enough. So it's just one to watch out for. I think key to note, people, a reasonable question, what can we use the funds for in terms of apprenticeships? It's actually just for the training. So in the rules, there is a kind of a long list of stuff that you can and can't use it for, but in a nutshell, you can use it for anything to do with the apprentices training, but nothing that you would have bought otherwise, and that includes the apprentices salary and also the cost of internal administrators or and so on and so forth. It has to be on the training. So the first vouchers will appear in your account in May, so you can put people onto programs in May, although April is when it is, that's the pay bill that is levied for the first time. I think really important to note is, if you click on Tim, is that if you use up all of your vouchers in a given month, government will pay 90% of what's left over. So, for example, if you've got £10,000 for May 2017 in your account, and in month one you put a whole bunch of people onto apprenticeship programs and you use up that £10,000, and the cost of the training is, say, another £5,000, government will pay £4,500 of that. You will only pay £500. Again, for me, this is encouraging in that it shows that the government really does want to, it's going to have to put its hand in its pocket in order to fund people who are really going for it with their apprenticeship.
Yeah, this really is a long-term strategy by the government, isn't it? I mean, they've been chipping away at putting various things in place. This now marks a long-term commitment, building the infrastructure, setting out the contracts, all that.
Yeah, and lots of you will have either been through or certainly heard of things like MVQs, other government training programs, Train to Gain. Some of us might even remember things like the YTS from many years ago. There have been so many different strands of training program. Government is really kind of putting its arms around, making this really the only major training program, and it wants employers to own that by getting them to kind of feel like they're in control and paying for it.
I think quite interesting, as we've talked to different organisations, to see the evolution over the last few months as we've been running these webinars. At the beginning, the majority of people not really knowing very much about it. I think through things like the webinars, through the news, generally by osmosis with colleagues as well, people have picked up the details, but actually now it's the crunch period of actually getting into the detail for it. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll there, and let me share those results with you as well. So I think the majority of people there feel either neutral or prepared for it, actually.
That's good. That's really good. I think Tim's right. I think people are feeling almost ready to go on this. So please, those of you who are in the 12% who are not prepared, or even the 42% new, tell us what your questions are, what it is that's outstanding in your minds about what you've got to do next. Is it you're not sure of the programs that you want to do? Is it not sure about your providers? It would be really interesting to know.
Yeah, thank you. And please do feel free to ask questions. You should see on the right-hand side of the screen now, there is a box where you can type in questions. I've had a couple of questions already. I'll be trying to bring those in where relevant as we progress through. But,
okay. Great. Okay. So that's the bit on the levy itself. I think it's worth also talking about the standards, the new apprenticeship programs. People who are already on an apprenticeship framework, which is the old style of apprenticeship, kind of developed by training providers and people like City and Guilds, not by employers necessarily, those will continue. So if someone starts on one of those today, even though obviously their apprenticeship will finish in a year or 15 months' time, they'll be funded under the current system, under the current rules. It's only people who start on May the 1st who will be able to have their apprenticeship funded through the apprenticeship levy. So it's important to note that. But what are these standards? Well, it's two bits per standard. One is a 2-page document which sets out the standard, combined with an assessment plan. Now, the good news is the standard is 2 pages long, and has to be 2 pages long. The assessment plan is a bit longer, but actually once you've read and understood the standard, the assessment plan kind of flows pretty easily, and it's just a description of how that standard will be measured and assessed. And there's lots of elements from one. That assessment plan looks fairly generic from one standard to the next. The standard, of course, is much more specific, and the standard sets out the skills, the knowledge, and the behaviours that someone who is on that programme needs to be able to consistently demonstrate in order to become a qualified apprentice in that occupation. The government have kind of, part of the quid pro quo of levying you 0.5% to pay for this training, to force you to pay for training, has been that you get to have a say over what that training actually looks like. And so any group of employers can come together. It has to be 10, 2 have to be an SME, and can create one of those standards. I think government's probably given the impression that that's much easier to do than it is. There is quite a rigorous process to go through of submitting an expression of interest and then working together to create the standard, submit it. You then need to find someone who's prepared to be the endpoint assessment organisation for that before it goes live. and then the government applies a funding ban. So it's typically 6 to 9 months, but it used to be like 2 years. So it's getting quicker and better.
There might already be some standards out there.
There are tons of standards out there at the moment, but there are tons that are also in development. We'll send out, when we send out the slides, we'll send out some links which will take you to the place where you can see which standards are live, ready to go right here, right now.
Yeah.
Those that are under development, and so may not be ready on May the 1st, or may not even be ready for June or even September, but are coming. And then also those where employer groups have submitted an expression of interest. So if you're interested in doing this, the first thing to do is to see, well, is there another group of employers who've already done half the legwork that you would need to, that you would want to do. And then it is just getting those employers around the table and thrashing out what you think together that standard should look like.
And it's about getting the balance right between having a standard which is going to be relevant to a particular employer or an industry, but then not having too many of them that it's just going to overwhelm.
Well, I think there's definitely going to be, there's been this kind of proliferation of apprenticeship standards. We're at peak apprenticeship standard right now, I think, Tim. There is so much work going on. We're involved in lots of it, for example, in the advertising industry for media planning and buying. We're involved in digital marketer and data analyst as well. And there are loads going on across most sectors at the moment. And it may well be that there are loads that were launched in a great deal of excitement and then no one takes them up because actually they don't quite seem as relevant as when they were first conceived. So there's definitely something of that going on. But what it does point to, and I think this is a really important thing if you're communicating with colleagues about this, who may be less familiar with it or less bought into it or whatever, is that year one of your deployment of the levy will be a funny old year. It will be a strange year. It will not be the blueprint for subsequent years. Partly because the way in which the money is going to flow is very new. There's going to be lots of trial and error. And then when it comes to the programs and who you're going to put on programs, if you're using it for graduates for the first time, say there's going to be some learnings and some experimentation, which by definition not all of which will work. But also not all the programs are going to be available on May the 1st that are probably going to be, May the 1st 2017, that are probably going to be available on May the 1st 2018. And they'll come on stream throughout this first year. So it's going to be a funny old year in that regard, and just important probably to set colleagues' expectations that this isn't your first year's program is probably not going to be your pride and joy. It's not going to be the finished article. It's going to be your experimental version of how you use the levy as a company. So just important, I think, to set those expectations with colleagues. The key thing about standards is they have this thing called the endpoint assessment, which is new and different. So in the old world of apprenticeships, for those of you familiar with them, let's say there were 30 things you had to do or show in order to qualify, and when box 30 was ticked, you were told, congratulations, you are now a qualified apprentice in whatever the subject was. In the new world, you have to go through a formal, people talk about it as a cross between a driving test and a Viva, interviews for kind of PhDs, somewhere around there, but it also involves a project, so a kind of a practical exam, I guess you would conceive of. So an interview, a practical exam, and a portfolio of the work that you've done, and an independent assessor. So no longer just the training provider and the employer saying, yeah, should we give them the award? Yeah, let's do it. It has to be done independently and verified to have gone through that formal process. That's a really big difference, because how you support and train the young person changes from kind of saying, right, let's just get them through a week's training or an hour's training on that and tick the box, to creating this kind of holistic, this holistically formed employee who can demonstrate the skills, can demonstrate the knowledge, and can show the behaviours required of the standard at the end of that apprenticeship. So it's a really big change, an exciting one, but no one really knows how it's going to work in practice. Endpoint assessment organisations are emerging every day, and we'll get the official register next month for who can do that. But it's going to be a bit of a journey of discovery for everyone involved in apprenticeships, how that's really going to work.
But it makes the whole function of learning and development much more rigorous and responsive as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it should do. It should do. And if you just click on this, one of the key things is the employer has to give a reference to say that the person is ready to go through to endpoint assessment. And then when they get there, at the moment with apprenticeships until now, it's been pass or fail. Well, you get your apprenticeship or you don't. Now there is fail, and you can do retakes, pass, merit, and distinction. So there are opportunities for people to really shine and push themselves. Each standard, this is where it relates to the money, has a funding cap, which is the maximum amount of levy vouchers that you can spend on that apprenticeship for that person. So, for example, our data analyst, the programme cannot cost you more than £15,000 in apprenticeship levy vouchers. You might come to an arrangement with your training provider which says, actually, the programme they do has some amazing add-ons and so on that you want to pay £16,000 for it. That's fine, you can come to that arrangement with the provider, but the government will only allow you to spend £15,000 of your levy vouchers on that. The remaining £1,000 would have to come from your own funds. More likely is that you will negotiate a deal with your training provider which says, look, we're going to do a certain number of these apprenticeships with you, can you give us a better price than £15,000? So there are opportunities to negotiate around that. You can't go under it, but you can't go over it out of the levy. You can go over it with your own funds. And the really tricky one, I think, here, and I want to be careful about what I say because the guidance is not clear on this, but at the moment it says 20% of the time has to be spent off the job, away from normal working duties, which probably is fine for, if you've got people coming in as grads or as school leavers. It doesn't seem ridiculous that that amount of their time should be spent doing the training. But if you've got existing staff who you want to put on an apprenticeship programme, and they've probably already got 6 days of work a week, let alone 5 to do, the thought of reducing their working hours by 20% is a scary one. We don't know exactly how this is going to be, where the guidance is going to fall in relation to this, but we do know that with 800,000 concurrent apprenticeships, the government is not going to be able to police the timesheets for every single person who's on the programme. And then there are some genuine definitional kind of issues, which is, if Tim, you give me 15 minutes of feedback because I'm an apprentice, when in other circumstances, if I hadn't been an apprentice, you might have only given me 5 minutes feedback. Is the 10 minutes, does that count towards this 20% off the job? Does the 15 minutes count towards what's off the job? It's genuinely a grey area. But what we think is, what we do, so what can you do in this regard? I think we do two things. One is embrace the spirit of what the standards are trying to do, which is about rigorous training, people really learning how to do the job, and so on. And also make sure you've got a way of recording and capturing the evidence of all the learning that they are that they're doing. We're happy to take questions on that. As I say, we're looking for some more clarity and guidance ourselves on that.
And yeah, I think that also reflects the way that people learn. I know in organisations where I've been leading a team, often you want people to go away and learn a new piece of technology or a new piece of software, a whole new skill set, and that's the challenge of digital skills. Yeah. But actually now this gives us a bit of a framework for recognising that time which they're spending on that training. Yeah. We've got a question here which segues nicely into the next poll. The question is from Stephen James, and he says, are there any restrictions in using levy credits for existing staff, retraining, for new role or upskilling in an existing role?
There is a restriction on it. So this box on the slide at the moment, there is a box which is, and that's what the cap applies to, but it also has to be compliant. It has to be, whatever's in that box has to support the achievement of the endpoint assessment. So if you go on to just one down, so there's your endpoint assessment. That's the thing you've got to get through. So when you're talking about existing training, can we put it into, make it levy fundable? It has to be something that helps the person who's receiving that training, has to be on an apprenticeship programme, and that training has to contribute to the achievement of the endpoint assessment. That's the kind of the long and the short of it. If you click further down, so here are the key components of a successful apprenticeship programme. So you've got that wrapper, your training provider, Arch or whoever else needs to make sure that whatever is being delivered is within that funding envelope, and is also compliant and delivering towards that endpoint assessment successfully. The key components of that is the job. If the job isn't right for the standard, then the person will really struggle, understandably, to demonstrate the skills, knowledge and behaviours to achieve the endpoint assessment. So it's really crucial that there is a strong fit between the standard and the job that the person is doing. It won't be perfect, it never is, but something like, 70%, if 70% of the standard looks like it's something that the person will do on the job, then you're getting into the realms of doability. You'll almost certainly never get 100%. There'll always be some areas of the standard which don't naturally occur in the job, and your training provider will work with you to help the person on programme nonetheless pick up that knowledge, demonstrate those competencies or illustrate those behaviours. And actually crucial to this as well is, thanks Tim, is the line manager. And this is something that we think you need to spend, if you get this right, if your line managers of apprentice people on the programme are motivated and into it, then you'll get a really fantastic result. If they're not, then everything else will be a struggle. This is the bit that kind of the off-the-job training, the specific moments, and whether they're done in 1 week blocks or 2 week blocks, or all done up front or done through 1 day a week. These are the bits where certainly government will want to see real evidence of strong off-the-job learning taking place. I'm now going to say a little bit into how we do it. We have a big online campus. We do lots of our training through virtual classrooms. And then we make this a requirement. Sometimes this is obligated training for someone who's going through our programs to do. Sometimes it's about preparing for their off-the-job or debriefing after they're off-the-job. And we also, in the interest of people wanting to overachieve, get that merit, get that distinction, give people opportunities to go further and faster than just to the minimum of achieving the qualification. And then moving on to thank you. You will have your own training that can also be included into the programme. The question actually is not, so what do we mean by included in the programme? Well, certainly, and very easy to do, is to make sure that the training that you give them, that you might give them yourself, is captured, recognised, seen as part of the programme, is captured as evidence for that endpoint assessment. That's easy. The bit that's a bit more complicated at the moment, and which we're waiting clarification for, is can you pay for this through the levy? For some standards, government's been explicit and said, you know what, you the employer with the provider, you can decide what off-the-job training you're doing, as long as it's relevant to the standard. So that's an important caveat here. But for some other apprenticeship standards at the moment, they specify, normally they give some options, but they specify particular off-the-job qualifications and certifications that can be funded by the levy, with the implication being that if it's not one of those, then you can't. But actually we're waiting for some clarity on that. We think in the end that government will probably say, look, it's up to you and your training provider to figure out whether you want to send them on this course or that course. And as long as it's relevant to the standard, then you should be able to fund it through the apprenticeship level. But we are waiting for some more guidance on that in National Apprenticeship Week next week. And then finally, in the spirit of, we talked about capturing all this evidence, you need to have some sort of mechanism for gathering the evidence of the experience that the person is going through. We at Arch use something called Hive Learning, which was actually a collaboration with Clive Woodward, developed initially actually for elite athletes, but now being used by lots of corporates and lots of other communities of learners. It's where's my phone? It's in my pocket. We'll send around a link to this so that you can see it. And we're going to ask people if they want to sign up, to people on the webinar, sign up to be part of a group on this to continue this conversation and share learnings. But I'm a member of a bunch of learning communities on this. All of our apprentices are a member of their own specific learning community, and as well as resources and useful stuff that they can look at, and mobile phones tend to be never far away from people, which means they're never far away from their apprenticeship. It's also a platform for collaboration, for interaction, and for people to begin to store their own evidence in whatever format they've got, a video of what they're doing at work, a PDF output of what they're doing, whatever it is, they can record this on Hive. If you don't have Hive, or you don't want to use Hive or whatever, you do need to have something that can capture in a really rich and interactive way the experience of the person over the duration of their apprenticeship. We think this is going to be really powerful for that endpoint assessment process.
Because of course there's that interaction between the line manager and other members of the team who have the knowledge and the experience, and then they want to share that with the apprentice, and there's a sort of informal way that information can be shared. But I suppose what Hive Learning or some of the technology will allow is that the ability to share that and request that information, so the apprentice can ask people for the information and then also record it and then use that as part of
capture it and organise it and show how they've absorbed it and so on and so forth. So just conscious of time, I want to just move on to the eligibility. I think the key thing about the eligibility is that as long as the person is not doing an apprenticeship in the subject that they did their degree in at a lower level than a degree, then they can be funded on the apprenticeship levy. And the crucial phrase that government uses is substantive new skills. So if there's someone who is learning substantive new skills because of the apprenticeship, then they can be funded through it. It's a massive change. It's a massive change in the whole conception of what apprenticeship programs are. No longer is it just about school leavers or even about people kind of, perhaps a bit older but getting into a trade for the first time. Actually, this is about anyone. Anyone can go on an apprenticeship. And I think, one of the reactions that we frequently get when someone, in a more senior position who's having to plan for the levy, so like the people, our audience, many of our audience, I'm sure, is they look at it and go, God, I wish this had been around when I was at their age. Or even, we often hear, half jokingly, can I do this? Can I do this? Because the learning experience is fantastic that people can get. So, the four kind of ways of thinking about it that we think of, one is the traditional school leaver program. The second is graduate programs. Certainly people who talk to us, lots of them say that their graduate programs suffer from, for lack of a bit of structure, formal qualifications. It's a bit kind of Heath Robinson contraption kind of put together that is rather variable, from year to year. Actually, an apprenticeship program provides an off-the-shelf structure and rigor. You can add other stuff to it to make it feel like a graduate program. Third group is, existing employees, so people you've already got and you want to upskill or professionalise their learning. But there's a fourth group which sometimes gets forgotten, which is your business as usual hires. Presumably, most large levy-paying employers are hiring dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of people a year. So to make that job that you're recruiting for more attractive, why not attach it to a training program, a CPD program, so you can outcompete in the recruitment market and of course increase retention. If people are on a 12, 15, 18-month training program and they want to see that out, well, you may get more of them than you would if you weren't investing in them. Of course, people often reflect the investment that companies have made in them in training by staying longer, and so you can boost your retention that way as well. So we think this is one of the reasons we think it's really exciting, actually.
What's your current gut feel about the percentage of the apprentice programs that you're going to be deploying on existing staff? Okay, so let me just close that and share that. I think it's a majority of people are saying it's an equal mix or most existing employees.
But very few on the grads, which is interesting, and that's sort of it fits about. I'd be interested to know, and now perhaps isn't the time to do it, but if we get the opportunity to talk to some of you about the grad stuff and why that's not doesn't feel so relevant. But yeah.
Going back to the next slide.
Yeah, so people lots of people are now saying, oh, look, all well and good, I get it. And obviously people on the webinar, most of you are kind of feel like you're more rather than less well prepared for this, which is good. But actually, what should you be doing now to plan for the levy? And I think we see this falling into three distinct categories of activity. The first is around just making sure your nuts and bolts are in place, the mechanisms are set up in good order, in good time, so that there's no need for panic once it all begins. The second bit is actually the strategic planning for how you want to use it. And then the third bit is, who are your training providers going to be, who are you going to work with? Some of you may be employer providers yourself, and you'll have been wrestling with lots of this stuff in probably greater detail than the people who are not employer providers. But we think those are the three kind of main things that you probably need to be thinking about right now. So on the nuts and bolts, in some ways, probably the easiest bit. But we'll send around the link to the apprenticeship service, which is as I say, the kind of combined account and shop, which you need to register on in order to use your levy. I would say it's straightforward but clunky, and you need to set up a kind of a master account, a master payroll scheme, and a master user, and then off that back of that you can set up then subsequent organisations within your organisation and payroll schemes within that, and also individuals with named permissions for doing various different tasks on that. So it's a clunky process, but I think once done, not too complicated, and once done, it's done. You need to make sure your payroll team are fully up to this. They should be. They'll have had communications from HMRC, but probably no harm in checking. You'll need to find a way, and this will depend on the size of your business and how you're structured and how many substructures you've got, but figure out a way of allocating the levy across. If you're levied as one entity, how are you going to allocate that levy across different parts of the organisation? Because while in principle, of course, obviously everyone gets their equal share of it relative to their payroll, but actually there may be strategically less benefit to someone having a small amount rather than pooling it together in another part of the organisation. And of course, a way of developing the strategy, who's going to be doing that, and a way of reviewing that. So the kind of the governance nuts and bolts. That's sort of job one. Job two is kind of the, I guess, the interesting bit, but the tricky bit, which is, well, what are you actually going to spend it on? And given that year one is likely to be experimental, what experiments are you going to kind of run? What are you going to try and find out in year one in order to give you a really strong understanding as quickly as possible? And that's, of course, what programs you might use, bearing in mind that some are ready now, some are not yet ready, so you may have a different set of programs in the first 3 or 6 months from those that you start in the second half of the year. Who's going to go on this? The question that we just asked. When are they going to go on it? And also linking that back to the strategy. Why that group at that time on that program? And then the final thing in terms of what to do, I think, is around providers. So given that you can only spend the vouchers on an approved training provider, which provider is going to be right for you, or which providers are going to be right for you? Lots of employers are saying, what's really important is that we have a single provider who can give us, it's one relationship to hold, it's one set of reports that we need to manage, it's one set of governance and contracting rooms, so on and so forth. But typically that, for companies who've got a wide range of apprenticeship programs that they're using, there's a real risk that that's at the expense of the quality of the training, because then you either typically either the big or the massive provider who at least says they can offer everything, or you get the niche provider who might be better at the quality, but obviously is not able to deliver the breadth. So there's a real conundrum there for employers. I think the key thing to remember is there are lots of people, us included, who are trying to go out there and look as slick and professional as possible. But the truth is, it's an immature market. No one has delivered apprenticeship standards at scale yet. So everyone is figuring out how they will do this. And so, I guess my only suggestion in this regard is find someone who you think you can work with as a partner for the long term, who can go on this journey with you. Don't pick on the basis of how shiny the slideware is in the sales meeting, because everyone is going to be learning how to do this as they go on. So pick someone who you trust to work with and work through issues which will inevitably arise in this world. So that's what I think.
Just in terms of timing, we're going to have to kind of wrap things up and we can get to questions there. Yeah. We will send through a link, as Ben mentioned, for the Apprenticeship Service website, so you can go through and have a look at that. We'll also supply some credentials about Arch and what we've been doing, some of the apprenticeship programs that we offer.
Oh, so shiny slideware. I was just talking about
shiny, We'll get it extra shiny before we get into that. And just one last poll I wanted to put to you, which was obviously what we've been talking about has been very specific to, very general. What we'd love to do is spend more time with you, and we have a range of experts here who work with those organisations who we've partnered with already and have set up apprenticeships. If you would like to get a free consultation, we're offering that to anybody who's attended one of these webinars. And they can spend more time with you, talking you through your own specific circumstances and really offer their advice on how to implement. I've got a question here from Tracy Charles. And Ben, I think we'll have to be very quick on the answer to this question.
Obviously. Let's get through as many as we can.
As an example, because the money will only show as one pot of money, it's not helpful that we can't show the council's spend against the school spend. We are having to use internal spreadsheets, which is a pain.
I think there is, at the moment, the apprenticeship service, it was called the digital apprenticeship service, has very limited functionality. They're trying to get the absolute core things right, and I think from a kind of from a project point of view, that's probably sensible, but there are going to still be some pretty clunky things that people will have to do internally, and I think for a council with lots of schools which are levied as one, it's going to be particularly, I think, complicated, and lots of small pots that might only buy one apprenticeship program per school. I think that's going to be the situation for lots of people. So
yeah. One last question, I think, and then we'll have to wrap up. Sure. Can the levy be used for those already undertaking an apprenticeship?
No, so people who are already on an apprenticeship program will complete their apprenticeship under the current funding arrangements. So it's only people who start their apprenticeship on the 1st of May on whom you can use the levy. So the government is phasing it out over time. So people who are already on the program or starting on any time up to April the 30th will be on the existing funding system. So no, you can't switch people from the old world to the new. It's only for new people.
But then we had a couple of questions come in. One was, how will the EPAs be assigned for the standards? If not, how will the payment be reserved for this? If they do not, how much will this cost?
So it's a moving. It's all in progress at the moment. So in some cases, yes, it has been the endpoint assessor. There is an endpoint assessor in the kind of pipeline. They haven't been approved. They won't be officially approved until March, until next month. So we can't know for certain, but there do appear to be those that are lining up for it. And this is going to be something that is going to be a problem, because you have to sign a contract which says this is how much the endpoint assessment is going to be, and you need to have that arrangement in place with the endpoint assessor. So over the next 2 or 3 months, it's going to be a very active area, and certainly we're kind of gearing up for, who do we think? Well, with our employer clients, it'll be a kind of a conversation. Who do we think the best endpoint assessor will be for our various different standards? The question is around cost. Now, the guidance says, the second half of the question is around cost. The guidance says it should be no more than 20%. What we're seeing in our bits of the market, so it's more kind of white-collar professional services type things, is that the endpoint assessment is probably going to be somewhere between 5 and 10% of the overall cost. But I think the way in which the dynamics will work is that you'll buy you'll set the fee with your training provider. Your training provider will then go off and do some of the grunt work and the negotiation to get as keen a price as they can, hopefully based on some bulk discounts and all the rest of it, with the endpoint assessor. So you're, as it were, through your training provider, able to join with others who want to go through a similar endpoint assessment, and by creating that economy of scale, we'll be able to get something off the price. There's then a conversation which we haven't gone through yet, which is, well, how much of that saving, if there are savings, is then shared with you, the employer, versus is that the contribution to the training provider's commercial objectives and their need to create some margin for their shareholders, their private owned, etc., etc. So we need to kind of step through this, but I think the overall amount, rule of thumb, 10% probably.
Okay. Just one very quick answer, if I go, Ben, to this last question. How much time do you think organisations expect will be taken up by the management of the digital accounts, and have they yet decided on the roles to be assigned?
Don't know. Don't know is the honest answer. I think it's going to be one of those ones though where it will seem like a nightmare for when you first engage with it, but I think it will become fairly business as usual and routine fairly quickly.
Yeah.
As I say, it's clunky but straightforward.
Yeah, particularly in that first year when those
and you should lean on your training provider to help you do some of that administration as well.
Which is a perfect segue. We will be running a number of other webinars in the future, getting more into the details, so please do join us for those. That brings us now to the end of the webinar on how you can turn the apprenticeship levy into an opportunity for your business. We hope to have given you some general pointers, but as I say, we'd recommend you take us up on the offer for a free consultation with one of our experts who can really get into the detail with you more specifically. So I'd like to thank Ben. Ben, thank you very much for your input and expertise, and also thank you, the audience, for your questions and for your attendance, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks.